about the Bible, the God's words, and you've got two different versions and they are not in agreement with the author of this missing passage, they starting collecting by buying, stealing, whatever, the source was.
Matt and I first heard about Dr. Maciej Eder when I was downloading his software package to analyze the books of the New Testament to try to figure out who actually wrote them. This sounds like a crazy story, but it's true. We saw some young guys on TikTok, and we'll leave a link below, who were claiming that they had some breakthroughs in the authorship of the New Testament. How did they figure it out? Well, they were using this statistical method called Eder's distance equation, I believe it's called. And there was an open source software package that you could use to run the same test that they were doing. So I did. And then I found out that there was a Dr. Eder who actually wrote the package. So we got a hold of him and we asked him all sorts of questions about ancient documents. Turns out he was trying to figure out who wrote the first document in his native language of Polish when he realized that with computer algorithms, you can now analyze the smallest words in a text, like and, the, but, of, the little conjoining words, and they actually leave a better fingerprint of an author than the big words do, which is what we had always assumed about authorship in like the church history. So he's been applying this new statistical method to old documents, and the results are fascinating. So if you're into old stuff or you're into new stuff, this one's for you. Welcome to the Austin and Matt podcast.
Welcome, Dr. Maciej Eder, to the Austin and Matt podcast. We are so pumped that you are joining us. Thanks for being here.
Hello, yeah. Thanks for having me. That's a big day for me to be with you.
Yeah. So the way that I found out about you is I've started to dive into this field of stylometry, and it seems to be quite vast and deep. And it seems like you are one of the godfathers of it in some way. Yeah. I mean, you wrote an algorithm that others are using. And so one of the things that I found interesting, at least just to introduce the concept of stylometry, is it's essentially using math and algorithms and machine learning to determine authorship of ancient texts. Do I have that right? Does that sound about accurate?
That's a very short description of the core of the concept and of the core of the subdiscipline. But is it a part of computational linguistics or quantitative linguistics? When you try to model the language, you want to guess whether or not the language can be predicted or modeled, or whether or not any peculiarities or idiosyncrasies can be found. Because if you think of a language or the language or a language, whatever, then we all use the same language, say English, but each of us has their own his or her own peculiarities or idiosyncrasies. And stylometry is one of the ways of measuring those non-systematic or very systematic but not systemic the features of language that are very typical to each of us or to some groups of us. So stylometry might ask a question about the differences between the female and male language, for example, if we believe in this binary model, of course.
Yeah.
Stylometry can ask a question whether some diseases or disorders such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, these kind of things can be measured or can be reflected in style and can be reflected by measuring the countable features of language. So stylometry is about measuring peculiarities and idiosyncrasies.
And it's specifically of writing, right? Not necessarily verbal. It's more writing.
Well, it's language, but the nicest insight to language is by writing, of course. But if it is about spoken language that is written down and then analyzed by the computers, no problem at all, of course. But what it measures is the written language ultimately, yeah.
And so you would use stylometry, for example, in what you just said. You could actually, let's say we have a bunch of writings by men and a bunch of writings by women, and we could actually put them in two buckets, and then an algorithm would run through it, and we would say, hey, can you tell that there's a difference, and is there a difference here? And and now we could feed it a new piece of text and go, was this written by a man or a woman? And based upon the data that it has, it would give you some sort of probability or something that it was written by a man or a woman. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's exactly the case, except that there's plenty of assumptions that we have to make. Of course, we'll be seeing some differences, but the differences in language are not only, genetic or dependent on our individuality or gender or whatever, but also on some sociolinguistic factors, such as our environment we live in is putting some pressures on how we write, how we speak, and it is relatively simple to tell apart female and male writing of the 19th century English literature. Very simple. You can just tell them apart just like this. And then you'll discover that on the male part, on the male side, there will be vocabulary very typical for the male authors, such as honor, bottle, wig, bottle 1012 pounds, something like that. And on the female side, there will be feelings, to feel this kind of vocabulary, and it really it's really stereotypical. It's embarrassingly stereotypical. But is it the difference between the brains? I don't think it is. It's a social linguistic factor that is very strong here. I mean, the expectations of the society for the union to write this way rather than that way, for the male authors writing to write this way rather than that way.
So you can maybe say, all right, the 1900s, we can differentiate between this is a man or a woman, but we would be cautious to say, well, because it's genetic, like you're a man, so genetically you write this way. You would say actually it might be cultural, because like men in the 1900s would write this kind of way because of their values and all of these ways, and women would write a different way. So you can't necessarily conclude that it's genetic, but you could, but it still kind of gives you the right answer pretty well.
Yeah. That's a very good description indeed.
Have you found that, would it be easy to forge a document? Like if, let's say you were a woman in the 1800s and you wanted to write like a man because you thought it would be perceived a different way, would that be difficult for a single human being, not without the knowledge of stylometry, without the knowledge of advanced statistics even? Would it be easy to forge a different writing style?
Well, if you knew the system, then you can attack the system if you know the backdoor or something like that. And there were some examples, good examples, and this is the Bronte sisters that were very ambitious, and they wanted to be generally in the literature rather than into the pigeonholed as a female literature examples. And they started writing as normal authors, but it was totally difficult for them to publish their stuff under their original names, so they decided to publish under the male names. So the Bell brothers, that's how they started their career, and their the respective these given names were the beginning with the same names, with the same letter as their original female names, right? So that's, if you know how to do that, yes, you can attack the system. Of course, it's more difficult to forge someone else's style. If we're talking not about gender but about individuality, it's much more difficult. But there are some authors that are particularly talented to do so. And one of my students was doing the French author Marcel Proust, and because he wrote a parody of Émile Zola and someone else, I don't remember exactly. And it turns out that Marcel Proust was quite good in doing one of those authors he was trying to forge, and not so good in forging the other one. So it depends, right?
Yeah. How did you get into this? How, like, because and I have the bio. You're the director of the Institute of Polish Language at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and you're an associate professor at the Pedagogical University at Krakow. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
I mean, you're running. How many grad students do you have underneath you?
Yeah, at the university, plenty. At the Institute of the Academy of Science of the Sciences, none.
Yeah,
Is grad students rather than undergrads, but it's like 20 grad students at the institute.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. How did you get interested? And yeah, I mean, because what's interesting about this is it's sort of taking a math approach to language. So, like, were you more of a language guy? Were you more of a math guy? How did you get
Yeah,
into
none of the above, I'm afraid. So my background as literature is early modern literature, a bit of ancient literature, but mostly early modern Latin, Polish literature. So the 15th, the 16th, the 17th century, that's where I come from. And like 20 years ago, I was doing this stuff. My PhD was on the 17th century literature. But then I discovered more and more anonymous cases to be cracked in both Polish literature, Latin, a little bit of Greek too, and it dragged me to the field of stylometry and assessing the authorship of anonymous text by doing statistical analysis of that style. And then I had to just catch up with maths and with linguistics. Then I became a linguist. But my original field is literature rather than linguistics. But to address your question, I'm more of a linguist rather than a mathematician. I'm not a mathematician at all.
And so you came across basically in your studies, it seems like maybe there was a lot of texts where we just didn't know the author. How is that common in all of our texts that we question the author with, at least in your experience of wherever you are? Is it how often do we say this is definitely the author, and how many texts, or do we have a whole under the iceberg, right, of just tons more where we just don't know who wrote anything?
Yeah, that's a good description. It's of course much more complex because once we start asking what the concept of authorship is and how it was shaped in the previous centuries, that's a big mess. But if we just stay where we are with this intuitive understanding of the authorship, then there's plenty of text from the ancient Latin, even poetry and prose, from ancient Greek, from biblical studies that are anonymous and attributed by some the scholars by using different kind of evidence. It can be either the external evidence of doing the chemical analysis of the parchment or this kind of things, right?
Yeah,
Or
right.
analysis of the ink, you name it, or the analysis of, for example, for letters, for epistles written by someone to someone else. Then you can guess the date and then try to attribute that this needs to be that person rather than this person, right? Because of the dates, right, and matching the dates, matching some events that are mentioned in literature or in those letters. This kind also help us to link the dates to the person, and this kind of like evidence, like detective evidence that you can use to try to attribute some text to some people. And that's what we've been doing for centuries in classical philology and philologists, generally speaking, in history, right? So that's the normal thing. But then in the 19th century, there started to be some ideas that the style itself can betray the authorship if you analyze the style itself, right, by statistical methodologies. Back then in the 19th century, it was very simple. I mean, those approaches were very simple, both in terms of the linguistic features, language features to be analyzed, and the mathematical procedures to be applied. But still, that was the beginning of the thinking that the style itself can betray the authorship. And one of the founders of the stylometry, actually the person who coined the term stylometry, Wincenty Lutosławski, Polish philosopher of the turn of the 19th century.
Ah, cool. Poland coming in hot with the stylometry.
It's here in Krakow where I'm right now.
Wow.
So he did a study on Plato. We can discuss that later. He did a study on Plato in which he kind of introduced the idea of stylometry. And he said that, hey, if we in the 19th century can send someone behind bars because they faked someone check, and we just use the handwriting to tell apart the authors, then come on, it should be even simpler with style, he said. He naively assumed. Now we know it's a bit of naive, kind of naive to assume that way, but still, that was the beginning of this thinking.
It kind of makes sense a little bit too, because there's just more data. I mean, one signature, that's not much, but if you write 10,000 words and I write 10,000 words, that's just a lot. At least the assumption is that's a lot of data that we can compare to each other to see maybe if there's some similarities.
Yeah, indeed. And the assumption turns out to be verified in the lab experiments. What I mean by lab experiments, there's plenty of work done in machine learning societies. Basically, machine learning is about doing lab experiments, because what you basically do, you train a model, whatever this model is, and then you take the testing data. So you take some samples of whatever task it is, and you anonymize it, or make it blind for a computer, right? And then you make the computer guess, and then you count how many times the computer was right, and then you update the model, tweak the parameters, learn some about language of whatever you are going to measure, and then you update the model, and then you observe the outcomes, how many good guesses you record, right? And then you learn how to extract this signature or whatever it is. In the case of the language, there's plenty of those lab tests in or on the texts of the known authorship, and you just anonymize them, and then you let the computer guess, and then you test which language features work best for this kind of task, right? So that's why we know it works. It does work, with some side notes that we'll probably be discussing later today.
Yeah, and so basically you can take known works and kind of tune the model to those known works in a way that to where you go, hey, we know these are all written by the same person. So let's at least tweak all the variables so that way that shows that that's written by all the same person, because we know that's true. So at least we're dialing in the variables to be fine tuned. And now that we've done that, now we can introduce other texts and we have a higher degree of confidence that those are whatever it says it is, because we tuned it to kind of an answer key that we already knew, at least for other texts. Does that make sense? Does that sound right?
Yeah. That's exactly the procedure. That's
What do
exactly
you
the
th-
procedure using widely across all the machine learning, applications. Except that here we are talking about language and language features, but outside this world, it can be some image features, whatever
Sure.
features
Yeah, that's machine
are
learning, I
used.
guess 101. But it knows it with words now. Oh, that's so wild.
what do you think it was that triggered the early stylometrists to start evaluating works? Because I'm guessing they would have already had like an oral tradition of who different texts were written by. What was it that started them questioning different groups of texts?
Yeah, if I may share my personal view, I think it was back in the third-ish century BC in the Greek Alexandria, when they started building the biggest library ever, just ever. And the idea was to collect all the works that had ever been written in the world. And they started collecting by buying, stealing, whatever the source was. They
Sure.
started collecting masses of papyri, and then they started discovering that the 12 or 15 versions of the Odyssey or the Iliad they collected are different. And it led to the question, wow, so what are these differences about? Are they original? Or if there is a longer version and the shorter version, how to attribute this difference? Right, is it original or not? So that's the moment when it started to be the question, who is the author of those differences, or some passages that are missing
Well,
here and
that,
overflow is here.
that's so interesting because I kind of compare it to today. We have social media, right? TikTok, Instagram, and very often somebody's taking someone else's work, putting themselves on top of it and talking about it or critiquing it or whatever, and that's now like a new work, right? But it's kind of a derivative from the original person who made the first version. And because that didn't exist 2000 years ago, the TikTok of the day was writing. And so it seems like quite normal, just as all humans are doing today. Back then, you could take a writing like the Odyssey or anything and modify it and throw your own flair on top of it or throw something on top of it. And you might try and pass it off as the original author,
Yeah,
or you
yeah,
might say, here's my critique. Just as humans are doing today, it's just sort of getting my mind into that space that they're doing it with text, not with TikTok right now. They're doing it
yeah.
with an
Us
actual,
don't
and
remember that the stuff that is being broadcasted by TikTok is just random people. Here, if it is about the Bible, the God's words, and you've got two
uh,
different versions and they are not in agreement, then the question of who is the author of this missing passage, well, it's kind of important, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask
It
you
was
to
like, yeah.
speculate on that? Do you think there was ever a time where there was a group of people that said, wow, we have these different copies of these texts, and for political or social reasons, it would be nice to actually unify it and create one text and get rid of extraneous copies because we don't want people getting confused? Do you think that there would have been power in doing that at any time when the written word was really the only way to get information around the world?
Well, the classical philology has a long tradition of doing exactly that. Out of the extant manuscripts of, say, Cicero, Caesar, or whatever, they try to like link them into a more or less concise or more or less consistent version, like a composite or whatever, because that's the only way of doing the real classical stuff available. Unlike the medieval stuff, here we've got two different or three different manuscripts containing the same text, but for example, in slightly different dialects. If we're talking about, say, French, medieval French, or medieval English for that matter, and those the manuscripts, they preserve the whole story, the whole microcosm, right, or the whole universe by themselves, and
Yeah.
making a mixture, making a composite out of them, it's probably not the best way of thinking about these things, right? So the other tradition is not to mixing them up, but just to keeping them to keep them separately as three or four different separate versions.
How well do stylometrists need to understand a base language that they're studying in order to run these analyses?
Well, if you really want to run these analysis, the only knowledge you need to have is how to click the run button, right? But
With the stylo tool that you created,
yeah,
you're
but
talking about.
Yeah.
actually, there's a good question of, is it enough really to just run a tool if you want to be confident about the outcomes of your analysis? That's a different question, right? But doing stylometry today is not really difficult. I mean, technically, right?
Because
Yeah.
you created the stylo R package, which everyone can download and use to run these models. And did you enable it for? You've already thought through the different languages and created settings for them? Is that why?
Well, yes, it was a side project. It was a private project. I wanted to do some analysis in a systematic way, testing out different parameters, and I wrote for myself a script to do so, because that was the easiest and the fastest way to do the thing, to have the thing done. Unlike the Excel spreadsheet that can also do the same thing, but it was like 10 times slower, or 100 times slower. So I just decided to write the script in a certain language. I decided to be it to be R, but that was a random choice, to be
Sure.
honest. And
It's a
then a
machine
colleague of
learning
mine,
language.
yeah,
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 right.
it is. And then a colleague of mine from the university said, "Hey, we can just extend it, generalize it, and then throw it at our students." And he did, and I got some feedback, and that's how it started to be something bigger than just a script for a personal use.
Did you have to
Can you?
teach yourself
Yeah.
how to program in order to do that?
Yeah. I'm a self-taught programmer.
Well, was that a long process, like figuring out how to? Because you had all these texts, you knew you wanted to analyze them, but you hadn't written. And what year did you start working on the stylo package?
Yeah, to be very honest, I'm old enough to remember the 80s and the ZX Spectrum computer that
Oh
I
shoot.
got when I was a kid.
No way. That's
Jeez.
cool.
That's
I use it
awesome.
mostly to play, of course, but not only, because
Obviously.
you get bored very easily with those very simple games. So I started to do some kind of para programming, or first versions of programming in this basic language, in
Yeah.
this logo language, and whatever they offered. So the general idea of programming, or doing an algorithm that is then runnable, was kind of familiar to me. And then in the 90s, when I got my first PC, it was easier to do a little bit of programming. So I have always been close to programming. I have never been trained to do so, but it was not a totally new world for me, to be very honest. So
How
yeah,
can you
most
explain that how can you explain the algorithm that you used? Because there's we call it Dr. Eder's algorithm around here. So how did you come to that? And like, we can go into the weeds as well. But generally, how did you work towards that, and how did you come to have confidence in sort of the one that you're using?
Okay, yeah. To start with, if you want to compare two different texts or two different entities, we are not talking about programming right now, but the mathematical algorithm to just
Yep,
compare two texts.
that's right.
So if you want to compare two texts in machine learning world, you have to divide them into those texts or to make a representation. This representation is usually a number of word frequencies. So you measure the frequency. We'll be talking in a couple of minutes, I guess, about the features. But basically, you analyze the frequencies of the words, of the first, of the second, of the third word, whatever, right? Something like that. And then you have to compare those profiles, those frequency profiles. You take, say, 100 of those frequencies of the words the, and, of, mother, father, whatever, right?
Yep.
And then you take like 100 of those, and you've got a profile of two or more texts you want to compare one against another.
So if I understand that correctly, basically one method is to count up all of the uses of common words or the highest use words frequency. So it's not usually the subject matter words like, New Testament. It's probably a, and, the, me, you, he, she, all of the common words. And basically by adding up the frequencies of those words, actually we may all have our own kind of footprint,
Yep.
both in frequency and in the distance between those words as written around in the text. Do I have that right?
That's exactly the case. It has nothing in common with this the algorithm you were mentioning. This is a general rule that has been discovered like 50 or 70 years ago by the one of the first stylometrists back in the 50s, in the 60s. They discovered that Mosteller and Wallace, they were exploring the Federalist Papers and the question of the authorship of some debated papers out of the collection. Some we knew were written by Hamilton, some were by Madison, but there were a bunch that we knew nothing about the authorship, either of this or that person. And Mosteller and Wallace discovered that the very good predictor is the difference between the frequency of the on versus upon. This single predictor alone is a very strong predictor for that very cause. But what is important here, it led them to the assumption that maybe this is not the content words, but the function words. It's instead the grammatical words that contain quite a lot of information about this authorial uniqueness. And they started counting the frequencies of the, on, of, this kind of function words. They collected like a few thousand of those and started comparing the frequencies of those words alone. So that was a very, very, very big step forward in this methodology. And now the big question, and here we come to this algorithm of mine, is how to compare these frequencies, this frequency profiles, if you've got two of them. Because if it's not an if, we know that the language is not a random phenomenon. The frequencies of the frequent words are not just slightly more frequent than the other words, but they are radically more frequent. It's a very, very big difference between the frequency of the and the word like whatever, microphone or keyboard.
Sure.
The difference is radical, like orders of magnitude. And now if you just count the frequencies and compare them side by side, then if you don't take this fact into consideration, then in fact you're measuring the frequencies of the three most, or four, or maybe five most frequent words. And this algorithm that I suggested to use is to add an additional weight to those unfrequent words so that they have more space to say something about the differences they produce. Right, so that we can compare the frequency of the word the with the frequency of the upon, because the relative differences is like huge between them.
You're telling me that we betray our identity in our own writing, that every human has their own sort of footprint or digital fingerprint whenever they write, and that while humans have been trying to figure out who's written what for thousands of years, and we've reached certain levels of sort of understanding, computers being able to analyze thousands and thousands of variables of my writing, I betray my identity almost. You could almost say that my style is unique to me, and it's not even in all the infrequent words, it's in the frequent words, a and the, those things. I'm just programmed to have those will all appear at a specific sort of clip, and that can reduce my anonymity in my writing. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. Not only this, because if the sample is big enough, then not only the vocabulary betrays your identity, but also this is the syntax, some grammatical features, the grammatical categories you're using. All of those language layers are betraying your identity, provided that the sample is long enough. Of course, that's a big question mark here, that if you take just one stanza of a sonnet, then it's just
It's
not
not enough.
visible.
You need enough data.
Yeah.
It almost, have you ever heard of Satoshi Nakamoto? He is the supposed inventor of Bitcoin. He, she, they, we don't know anything about it, about him or her or them. And they released the Bitcoin white paper. And everybody wants to know who's the author of Bitcoin. So it seems like what you're saying is there's a world where we could take the Bitcoin white paper that we don't know who the author is, and let's say we know who, we have 10 10 highest suspects, right? Or of who we think could be Satoshi. We could, if we had enough writings from all of those people, we could probably, we could probably figure out if they wrote the Satoshi, the Bitcoin white paper. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. However, there's this if, right? We would have to have some reliable, samples of the writings long enough to train the model. Surely so, but
Wow. Is it possible for a
We need to
person?
do that.
yeah, you could do that. You can do that.
Oh my gosh.
However, we have to assume that this manifesto is single, but is
It could be
single.
a group of people. I mean, but we'll
We
learn.
don't
Either way,
know.
it sounds like we can learn. Maybe even we don't get all the way to the answer, but maybe we could learn something about running stylometry on top of the Bitcoin white paper, that kind of idea.
Oh yeah, that for sure. But again, I hardly believe this is a one single authored paper. It
Sure.
might contain lots of some quotations or hidden quotations or whatever to mess with the style, to blur it a bit. But still,
Oh, so
that could be telling too.
how do you normally deal with quotations within text? You just remove them?
I kind of do remove all the prefaces and afterwards this kind of things, footnotes. If possible, I take them out. But if this is a part of it, we are touching here a very, very, very big question of what authorship is after all. And to start with it's not an absurd example, but just a extreme example. In the 17th century Polish literature, there is a cycle of very short poems, which is a cycle. That's very important. That it has its climax, and it's the construction of the whole set is very important here. And the final piece, the final like three stanzas, this is purely a plagiarism. The guy purely took it from someone else. So it's not written by him, but it fits ideally into this climactic, moment of that cycle.
It was very well done plagiarism.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. And my question is he not an author after all? He kind of is, because he knew how to put this final piece in the right place, right? So, yeah. So back to the quotations. If there's a person that quotes a lot, but this is, kind of to support the argument, maybe this is a part of the authorship. Think again of the not the Bible itself, but the church fathers and those theologians in the past centuries. They were plagiarizing very, very often, because if you see someone else's work from the past centuries and you think this is right, then why argue with the fathers?
Right.
You just
Sure.
copy them.
It's good.
This
It's
is
good
true.
words, and you don't know there's going to be computers in 1,000 years that can analyze what you did or not. You're not
Sure.
taking that into consideration when you're
But
doing this. It's
plus, if
crazy.
someone did, good job,
Yeah.
just incorporate it.
And so can you what was the moment where you realized that this was kind of powerful for you, or like it was really truth telling? Weren't you analyzing 16th versus 17th century Polish texts, or
I
what's
did.
it, like when was the moment where you kind of ran your first dendrogram or whatever, right? And you get
Yeah.
these results back and you just said, "No way, this is incredible." Like did you have a moment like that?
I did, but it was not the moment from the very beginning when I felt this wild thing, because the first piece I wanted to attribute was actually a failure, because of the sample size. With a colleague of mine from the Jagiellonian University here in Krakow, we are trying to address 17th century Polish writer Mikołaj Przarzyński and his very vivid erotical poems that are sometimes attributed to him, sometimes not. He's one of the metaphysics, so you can kind of compare him to George Herbert and those big John Donne, those big English metaphysics. The
Okay.
same time, basically the same time, basically the same topics, and equally good, I would say, if not better. And the question whether or not he wrote those erotical, obscene poems was quite important for the interpretation, of his attitude to life. But the outcomes were like not decided and blurry and
Oh, okay.
not really
Inconclusive.
not conclusive at all. So what I did, the following study was I just took. I wanted to address specific to the question: what is how big a sample needs to be to finally see the signal, and I collected like 60 or 70 longer novels, English, Polish, some other languages like 5 languages. And I did it independently for those languages, and then in this like machine learning a way of doing the lab tests, I know the answer, the computer does not know the answer, right? I anonymize all the samples and I see how it does the job under certain conditions. And these
Yeah.
conditions being, I was just spoiling gradually the samples, making
Yeah.
them shorter and shorter and shorter, in order to see when it collapses. Of course, it
Oh,
collapses,
yeah. So,
right? But I wanted to see the point. And that was a big wow moment in my life when I realized that, hey, for long samples it really works. It really shows the authorship across those 60 or 150 novels. That was a wow moment in my life.
so you set up an unsupervised model, so the math doesn't have any leading towards what's what. It just says find patterns, and then you took the texts and kept increasing the text block size in the equation, and it was nothing, 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 or and then it got stronger, and at a certain size, boom, it all locked together and kind of
Yeah, yeah,
showed
yeah.
authorship, and
It
you
was
see it sort of
yeah.
materialize. Is that sort of what happened?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Except that it wasn't like a sudden collapse. It was declining and then it collapsed. But still,
Sure, but still, you see to see the results and to see it meaningful. That is meaningful. It's a
it
meta. It's
is.
a meta layer on top of. It's showing that the analysis is working.
It was actually the moment in my life when I realized that it really, really works if some conditions are being met.
So how does this? So can you? So humans have been trying to figure out who wrote what for thousands of years. It sounds like we've been taking a data driven approach, or at least introduced a data thoughtful approach as early as 150 years ago. So it how has stylometry progressed throughout the ages? Because I was reading some critiques on it, right? I mean, it's like maybe this is hard, right? Because we have humans that are linguists and they're sort of having opinions on who wrote what, and stylometry is much more about math and algorithms just giving you cold-blooded answers. And so I would think there'd be a lot of pushback from humans around stylometry.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
how's that come about? What's been the history of that sort of sentiment around stylometry for
yeah,
over
yeah,
the
yeah.
last 100
Good point.
years?
Some of the criticism is or has been justified because the first the stylometric methods were kind of crude, kind of very simple,
Okay.
which I understand might raise some questions today.
Yeah.
Because if we look back to the very first ideas how stylometry could be used even without naming it this way, that was like in the 15th century. There was a guy um, Lorenzo Valla was his name, an Italian humanist who was absolutely fluent in Latin as one was in that time, but he was also fluent in ancient Greek, which is important here. And he took on his desk donation by Constantine. So the Emperor Constantine allegedly gave the power over Rome to the popes forever. That was the document
Yep.
saying. And
Right.
the popes, of course, were very kind of, they like to use this document.
They love that document.
Yeah, they love the document
Sure.
to justify the right to
Yeah.
the
That's
land.
huge.
And Lorenzo Valla looked at that text and say, but well, look, this Greek language is very, very vulgar, and it's hardly possible it was written in the 4th century when Constantine was alive. And he started, that's where the stylometric moment starts. He started to count those instances where, for example, the feudal terminology was used. You know, in the 4th century, no feudal
Yeah.
countries
Sure.
were there, right?
There was no feudalism. Very little feudalism in the 4th century.
Not at all.
Yeah. Right. So you're talking about it, and the
Yeah,
subject
he
matter is
started
sort of
to counting
anachronistic.
the grammatical mistakes of the Greek language, and again the mistakes that could not have been made in the 4th centuries, but could have been made in the 12th century because of the influence of Latin, this kind of things, right?
Oh,
And
interesting.
he started just counting this evidence. So to me, this is the first moment when the stylometric thinking was around. So let's
Totally.
take the evidence, let's count it, and let's then see if the evidence is big enough, right? And then if we move forward, that was
But that's really just a feel. That's not really math. That's kind of like, I could see as a critic of that, you would say, well, yeah, but okay, they made those mistakes in the 12th century, but it seems a lot more harder to believe in completely because it's almost interpretive as far as like, but I mean, as far as if you're making a bunch of grammatical mistakes, you know, you know what I mean? I can see how it's still crude. Before you get computers involved, there is still a level of crude evaluation.
Yeah, I get the point.
Yeah.
The point. But this is, this idea of gathering evidence. That was quite
Yeah, that's an
strange,
interesting idea.
right?
Yeah, right.
I think
Because
what's also
ultimately, you never can say for sure, like 100% probability. You can say 99 point whatever, right? But it's never
Sure.
100%. But the more evidence you acquire, the more difficult it is to just destroy it or put your counter argument, right? So gathering evidence per se, that's a big thing. That's a big thing.
And it sounds like his intuition was the same as mine would have been when I started, which would be to use the big words, count the biggest words that seem the most like subject oriented. And that's what's so interesting about your tweak on everything is you I guess later on people were counting the small words, but then you figure out a way to sort of match the small words and the big words to find a sweet spot that really creates that fingerprint.
That's correct. So in the 19th century, there were a bunch of people, a bunch of scholars, mostly interested in a couple of topics. One of them being Shakespeare and the Shakespearean canon. The other being Shakespeare, of course.
Of course. You got to see if he really wrote all those.
Yeah.
Of course.
Shakespeare being topic number one, topic number two, being the Bible, of course, the New Testament and Pauline's epistles, of course,
Yeah.
and topic number three, which is today not a big thing, but it used to be. It's Plato and Plato's dialogues. The authorship of Plato's dialogues and the dating of particular dialogues. That was important to prove some things about Plato. And these guys of the 19th century, Augustus de Morgan, Konrad Maskell, and this Vincente Lutosławski that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they were trying to find some language characteristics or language features, as we would say today, to describe this uniqueness, stylistic uniqueness, and they switched from those very typical words to some non-lexical patterns. For example, average word length as a predictor. Not very good one, but still, that was a something.
Yeah,
Right?
average word length. That's pretty good, actually.
Average word length, that's a thing. Average sentence length, another predictor. And they started observing, for example, in the case of Plato, that the endings of each sentences are likely to be rhythmical. So they started to count those rhythmical patterns at the end of each clause or sentence. That's for Plato. For Shakespeare, there are some other things like that. But it doesn't need to be necessarily the lexical level. It can be some other predictors that they were thinking about. When the lexical level is concerned, they were kind of going in circles, and they were stuck in this thinking that the typical words, this is the thing we have to measure, right?
Yep.
So it was those guys in the 60s doing Mostel and Wallace doing the Federalist Papers that discovered the power of the grammatical words. So they flipped the game.
They were
right?
studying the Federalist Papers. Got it. Man.
And then, they followed some studies, not really in authorship, but in cognitive meaning of those, not really meaning, but the cognitive existence of this very, very tiny grammatical words. For example, there is the test. I wish I had this sentence for you, but I will send it to you later.
Sure.
You got a sentence in English, and the goal is to count all the instances of the letter F. And the best performers, you've got like 5 seconds. And the best performers get like 6, maybe 7, whereas in fact there's 10 of those. But we just skip off, we skip 4, we skip the function words as we read, and count.
Totally. Right. We naturally jump over those.
We naturally just skip that.
Yeah.
Of course, we process them subconsciously, but that's the case, right? That we subconsciously use those words, but we don't pay much attention when we deliberately want to write something down.
Wow.
And that's the beginning of this thinking that, let's measure the function words rather than the content words, because also of that property.
Oh, I love it. I think that's so cool. It's
Not
like,
only that,
yeah.
there's another there is another theory, a very, very strong one, by the way. If you count the word frequencies, I was also I said it already a couple of minutes ago, but let me go back to that. Then the frequency of the word, for example, the most frequent word, the, is much more frequent than the second on the list, which might be, say, in. So there is a mathematical model that can be used to describe that property. It's referred to as Zipf's law, because George Zipf in the 40s discovered that thing, and he linked it. That's the interesting part. He linked it to the theory of the least effort, saying that those words that you're using very often, right? Because we are lazy.
Yep.
Our brains are very lazy. So if you can optimize for energy by using the words from your cache memory, right? Like rapid access memory. These are the function words that you don't really think deliberately when you're using them. That's another reason of measuring these words rather than the content words that you deliberately have to drag out from your memory by spending some energy, which you don't with the and of for.
That makes total sense. It's just again, you betray your own identity in the way that our lazy brain just uses all the filler words to make everything keep going. We all do that very, very uniquely. And math, with enough data, an algorithm can pick you out.
Yeah, that's exactly it. This uniqueness is, of course,
stylometry. Oh, go ahead.
This uniqueness, of course, is affected by many, many different factors, sociolinguistic factors, as I said, that the society expects you to be quite elegant in style when you receive your Nobel Prize, for example. That's a different style than you use in comparison to some other situations, right? So that's one of the factors, but these factors are plenty. And these factors include like your education, the books you've read, your teachers, your parents. So it's not that this uniqueness of style is purely genetic. It's not in your DNA. It's a combination of those different layers and factors, right? So this the brain laziness is also affected by other external factors as well, right? To make
Yes.
up this final
So
stylistic movement of yours.
you're saying, if I could recap that, you're saying the key to the small words is that the way that you learned the small words through every step of your life, whether it's what was easiest to pronounce as a kid, or what you heard the most from adults, or how you were taught in school, or what literature you read, all of those things get fed into one brain, and that's probably the hardest part to change when you're writing, because that's been baked in since you first learned how
Yeah,
the
yeah,
smallest
I
words in
think
your
so.
language work. And
You
so it's
could if you made an effort, but you don't make an effort if you just have to write something.
yeah, right. And so
If
in
you
the
deliberately think of, because there were some writers that deliberately did affect their own style. There's an example of a Polish writer, Bolesław Prus, whose diaries were recently discovered, and he writes to himself, "I'm doing too many adjectives, so I should." Because I've counted them, I should decrease the number of adjectives in my, following book, something like that. And this is a very, very rare example of people being aware of their style.
Yeah, most people aren't thinking about how they're delivering a message. They're just thinking about the message they need to deliver and trying to get it out, I think. So
So
it sounds like there was a history of gathering data on different texts for all the way back from like the 2nd century. And then in the 60s, there was this breakthrough where you're starting to measure the small words. And they had this idea, oh, maybe the small words create a better fingerprint. And then what intuition, I'm guessing that's where you started as well, because that was like the latest research from the 60s. What intuition did you have, or what did you feel that you thought, man, I need to create a new algorithm to measure different documents?
Well, yeah, this intuition is very simple, and it boils down to this thing that some words are very frequent, some are less frequent, because those algorithms are there. There's plenty of those, and there was a very nice and heavy thinker, John Burroughs from Newcastle, Australia, uh, he died like 3 years or 4 years ago, 95. He was. I actually met him,
okay,
a very
cool.
nice guy. And he was an English literature person or scholar. And again, he was mostly a literature guy with some understanding of maths, without real understanding, but with a very good intuition. And he was the first one to introduce this methodology back to the literary studies and to his study of Jane Austen style. And he was the first one to discover that those very frequent words should be kind of scaled down. So his idea of using scaling in mathematical terms, it's using z-scores or z-score, z-scoring
Yep.
procedure, which is a very simple thing, but there needs to be one person to first realize that, hey, let's use this procedure. So after he used this procedure of scaling down, the D and off, and scaling up some other like on upon those not so very frequent words, and then he started observing like things happen. That was another tacit breakthrough in my eyes, and I just added. I just fine tuned this idea of his by further tuning the frequencies of the most frequent words down, so that each of the words has something to say. My assumption was that if you look through the list of all the frequencies, from the very frequent to the very, very non-frequent, then after all the signal lives somewhere close to the top of this list rather than across this list. Because what Burroughs did, he just flipped it over and did each word the right to vote, like in the wilderness, right? It was
Oh,
revolutionary, but it
yeah.
was slightly too big of a revolution to me, right? So I kind of trimmed them down.
So then would it be a fair statement to say that you think that that stylometry has come a long way in the last 10 years? Like how much is computational power helping stylometry? How much is the machine learning, because we've had some of these algorithms for 50 years, right? And so it's like, to what degree has stylometry gotten a bump in the last 10?
Yeah, the step is huge indeed in the last 10, on two different levels. One is our understanding of language and this stylome, or this fingerprint, because now with the advent of say large language models and this kind of things, we can very easily annotate texts for not only vocabulary but also for grammatical categories, for syntax, for whatever.
Oh
And
my
then we can
gosh,
enrich and enhance our
dude.
language output or text like radically, right? So that's one of the elements of this revolution. This is going beyond the lexical level with the help of tools such as LLMs.
It's like our vision into texts is going from like 480p to 4K. It's like we could just
That's
see all the grains of the letters now, like in a way that we've never could
Wow,
have seen,
yeah.
in all the
that's it.
angles.
That's it.
And it's
That
all of
we
a
can
sudden.
enhance the input data like radically, dramatically.
Well, and I had read that the stylometry was used to out J.K. Rowling, right? Because she was Robert Galbraith in the Robert Galbraith
Yep.
series. What is it called? The Cormoran Strike series. Is written by J.K. Rowling, but Robert Galbraith is the author through pseudonym, and stylometry was used to basically show they're both J.K. Rowling. Like, you take both
Right,
authors, and
right.
she couldn't hide from it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's
The
starting
Cactus
to.
Calling, yeah, that was the title of that book, written or published by an anonymous person or
Yeah.
unknown to the society. This Robert Galbraith
And now
sold by
machine.
1,000 copies, and that was it. And
That
then
is
after the stoichiometric test, when she was faced that picture, and she said, "Well, yeah, I have to admit that was myself." Then the sales rate
boom.
was skyrocket, of course.
That is incredible. I mean, this feels like arguments that have been going on for thousands of years over so many texts, and math is finally hitting a point that's being really helpful and kind of taking opinions off the table because it's more hard data. I mean, there's still interpretation, and to your point, it's hard to go, oh, it's 100%. Sometimes, I mean, not that it's not possible, but it really is incredible that we're introducing sort of machine learning at scale into text analysis and all the different factors. And just, I mean, it makes sense. As humans, we can only hold like 10 or 20 variables in our brains when evaluating something, and machines can do 10 million variables. So it has to, if we can point them in the right direction, they'll be helpful.
Yeah, and this is not our last word, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
What are some other breakthroughs that you like? What do you have any other these text analyses that we've been surprised by that people have used this to kind of figure out different authors?
Yeah, the other breakthrough is like, I remember the times like 10 years ago when if you collected 100 novels across one tradition, that was a big wow. That was really shocking for some people.
What does that mean?
Actually,
What do you mean?
the availability of text, which
Oh, you can just
increased by
get the
a
text.
couple of
Yeah.
orders
Okay.
of magnitude, right?
Oh,
And
your
now
data
back in
collection
the
is
60s,
increased. Totally.
yeah. Think of a situation, think of a scenario when you've got your Federalist Papers, and that's your all, corpus, and you're inferring whatever you want to infer. You're testing your methodologies. You're building a theory around that very small amount of text or small number of texts, right?
Sure.
Compare it to like millions of texts that you can just grab and test your theories and methodologies against. That's it. That's a new world.
Where do you get ancient texts from? This is one thing I've been wondering, is like, if you're looking for Plato's original works, where do you go? What's a trusted source that you would go to find those?
Perseus project. That's my suggestion.
The Perseus
This is
project.
Perseus project. Yeah.
So
totally
that's like a known resource inside the field of academia. Is it just like disparate resources that you kind of have to know being an academic, or is there
Not
like
two, because there's quite a number of those. And back in time, every single scholar had their own tiny, very small and tidy collection on their own floppy disk. not to share it with anyone, right? Now the world has changed radically, and now in GitHub you can find quite a lot of resources. However, they very rarely speak one to another. Those resources, I mean, and the formats are not identical, or they are not compliant with the same format. So there are some issues, of course, but there are some respected sources like the Perseus project that was started, if I'm not mistaken, back in the 90s, something like that. It's a very, very stable and solid resource with all that you might want to have if you do the text analysis. There is a number of similar libraries for later Greek literature, like the patristic literature, for the biblical sources. These are there is a number of the sites when you might want to go.
It
So-
feels
Go ahead.
well, it feels like we're missing a central repository, like as humanity, because I think Tufts University runs the Perseus project. Is that right? So like what happens if Tufts goes bankrupt or like goes away? Like does it all go away? Or do we all just have forks on GitHub? It does feel like we need like a central package manager. I also just want to be able to say like load in all of Plato's text, and it's just like whoop, here's all the trusted sources in the same format. Here's the format. I guess tools like that don't quite exist yet, do they?
They don't. They don't. And the question of getting bankrupt is not an absurd question indeed, because we are not ready to we don't have really backup of the internet, right?
Yeah.
That might be an issue at some point. Not only that, those resources are kind of living creatures, because whenever you change something, you add a text, you make a correction or whatever, it's not identical with what you got a month ago.
It's version
So
control.
if you want to just freeze it and record it on your floppy disks, then which version should you stick to, right? So it is
Version
one of
control.
the challenges in front
Yeah,
of the
because
humanity.
I see like all these YouTube videos of people saying, look at this ancient text, or look at this thing what so and so said back 500 years ago. And I always think, where did you get the document? Like, how do I know that the document you have means anything, or it's a copy of a copy, or like what are we
That's a
dealing with?
different question. That's a different question, because not only we deal with the electronic copies of the electronic versions of an edition, but the edition itself, the edition prepared in the 20th and the 19th century. Yeah, that's a big thing. It might be a combination of many the different manuscripts or papyri or whatever. It can be there's plenty of of decisions that the editors introduce along the line.
Yeah, they
For
have to.
example, that's the reason that a very strong predictor in stylometry is punctuation marks. This is a very strong thing. But first thing I do, I get rid of the punctuation whenever I do any ancient texts, because the punctuation was introduced in the 19th century by baby schools.
It's added after
We
the
don't
fact.
want to
Oh my
see a
God.
nice signal which is produced by the editors rather than the authors.
So
the editors will put a signal. Yeah.
if you were using the punctuation, you would be figuring out which editors it had, not anything about the author, which could be a different test.
Yeah, muddies the data, basically. Yeah.
Wow, it's so interesting.
Not only the particular editors, but also some editorial traditions. I mean, the French punctuation is slightly different than the English punctuation, than German, and you can see those traditions shining through if you don't get rid of the punctuation of the ancient texts.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
well, yeah, I'm wondering, do you think LLMs will get to the point where they can just look at a text and you can say, was this Plato? And it will be able to answer better than a proper stylometric analysis? Or do you think it will always come across as somewhat baseless because you don't really know how the LLM got to its conclusion? And you just...
Yeah, first and foremost, there's an assumption that LLMs are going to be ultimately better than human beings in solving those problems.
Sure.
Which might or might not be true, because LLMs are as good as their training data is. And for Plato, we are not going to have like millions of Platos.
Yeah.
So the model is not going, in my view, is not going to be radically better than what we have now. If we restrict ourselves to Plato, of course. I'm not
Because
saying
it's a data limitation, basically.
it's a data limitation.
Yeah.
And the other question that is embedded in your question is that some of the disputed cases are disputed exactly because they are kind of at borderline cases. that Plato had a worse day or a better day. It does not really fit to, right?
There is no real answer. It could have been. It's on the line, basically.
It's on the line. Yeah.
And there's not enough to know. Do you have? So we've been playing around with it, and that's how we found out about you. But I think we asked you if you had a dendrogram that you would be willing to share, and because I think what would be helpful for me also, because I've looked at these dendrograms, but I'm just my own brain's looking at it. But for me and for anyone else watching, can you show us a dendrogram and kind of explain how you got to that point, and then we'll walk through sort of the branches and what that looks like.
Oh yes, totally. I'll be happy to do so.
And while you're pulling that up, I'll just explain. So basically, you load up a bunch of documents and you run this algorithm, and all those frequencies of words that we were talking about, and you take the chunk and you chunk it up. And then basically, this will take those chunks and organize them and cluster them according to like how similar they are to each other. And so a dendrogram is a clustering of text chunks. So for example, if you were going to do it on the Bible, you could do it by chapters. And so it'll take 1 Corinthians 1, 1 Corinthians 2, and it'll cluster them all together if they were all written together. You know, if they seem like they're the same author, it'll cluster them. So a dendrogram is a visual representation of how these clusterings of texts are related to each other or aren't.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's a visual representation. It's one of the methods of showing the similarities that are being computed by one of the algorithms you mentioned, this other algorithm. There's plenty of other algorithms as well. So this final dendrogram, or this tree-like structure, is a final representation. And as you can see in the picture, I hope you can see the picture, it is divided into those leaves, which are particular text, and the branches. And the bigger the branch, the more text they clustered within that branch, or a similar one to another. Here we've got something which is very, very important for the Polish tradition, because this is the question: who was Gallus Anonymous? Gallus Anonymous is the beginning of the Polish literature, even if it is not in Polish, it's in Latin. But that's how all our literature starts. So it's quite important, has been important for centuries, who the author was. We know that it's anonymous in Gallus, so maybe from Gaul, from France, but there are different ideas that this person might have been actually from Hungary, or that's you're seeing the picture where I test the hypothesis, the Venetian hypothesis, saying that this person might be identical with monk of Lido in Venice, who wrote the Translatio Michaelis, or the translation or the transportation of the bones on Saint Michael. And here we've got different text. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but whatever.
And just for anybody who's listening to just the audio, it's a document that says Gallus Anonymous at the top. And so we're analyzing an author, Gallus, and we're trying to see what if it's true or not. And then imagine a family tree where you kind of have the patriarch at the top, and it splits and splits and splits, but just turn it 90 degrees to the left. So the top of the family tree is on the left side, but now it branches to the right, and we're seeing clusters of different titles basically on certain branches. Basically, that's what a dendrogram looks like.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I've collected here because the Stylometry is always about comparing. So you have to compare your thing against some other things, similar things, of course. And here I've collected a bunch of similar texts from the 12th century. And we see that another translation, or this transportation of someone's bones, of Saint Agatha, is very similar to the chronicle of the monastery of Saint Michael. These are found to be similar. And then the next most similar to these two is Bernardus Silvestris, the life of Malachias. And then we've got an interesting cluster with Gallus Anonymous, Chronica Polonorum, or the Chronicle of the Poes, and this translation or transportation of St. Michael's bones, very close one to another. Even if I tweak the parameters, let me just switch from one picture to another. The picture is slightly different because I tweak the parameters. and then the final picture is different. But still, whatever I do, I cannot kill the signal of the monk of Lido in Venice being very similar, really similar to Gallus Anonymous. So that's, that's the evidence. That's not the final, that's not the smoking gun, of course, but that's a very strong evidence. Here I'm just showing you the tip of an iceberg, because I used some other the machine learning methods to show, or to test to which extent those two are similar one to another. And it turns out that the similarity is very, very, very strong. So this is really a strong hypothesis, or strong evidence in favor of that hypothesis, that these two guys are the author of the same, that we are dealing here with the same person, in fact.
And I think that's a really good point. Is that this isn't just like, hey, you see a dendrogram and oh, these are similar, so they're the same. No, it's a part of it is the process as well, and you actually want to tweak the variables to see if you can actually break the connection, right? Like, let's steelman the opposite idea and go, well, okay, Monachus Translatio and Gal Chronica, can we tweak it enough to where those things break apart? And if they keep clustering together with reasonable variables modification, then we get more and more confidence that those two are the same. Versus if I can keep dialing the variables and now I can make it jump all over the place depending on how the variables are, maybe we can't conclude that those two texts are so similar because it depends on how we tweak the data. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's a very good description. And let me switch to another example. Here's the picture, but before we go to the picture, this is Greek. This is ancient Greek, the Greek tragedy, tragedy and comedy in this very picture. So as we remember from our secondary schools, there were three the writers of the tragedies that are extant. This is Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides.
Yep.
And Aeschylus was the author of 7 works that are extant. Sophocles somewhat more, and Euripides 20 something. I don't remember the exact name, the exact number. But there has always been the problem with Prometheus Bound. That work by Aeschylus has always been questions for different reasons. One of the reasons was that Aeschylus is very archaic, also in his piety towards Zeus, the god. So for his the remaining 6 works, Zeus is a very good god, like a good father, something like that. Whereas in Prometheus Bound, he's a mean personality. I mean, we don't like Zeus in that one. So that's argument number 1, put forward by the classical philologist. Argument number 2 is metrical patterns or versification patterns. As you probably know, the Greek tragedy and Greek poetry in general are using some certain patterns are allowed and certain are not, but you've got some flexibility. And now within this flexibility, those 6 works by Aeschylus are likely to use slightly different patterns than Prometheus Bound. So that's the second argument. And the third is that we know that Aeschylus was the author who introduced the second actor on stage. And here in this Prometheus Bound, we've got one tiny stage where, well, we basically need 3 actors to perform that scene. And of course, one of those is mute, does not speak at all, but still, it's very likely that we need 3 actors to perform that scene, and that's the argument number 3. And now, if we perform stylometric similarity, here it is. This is a dendrogram, except that this is an enhanced dendrogram. I've just used different settings in different particular dendrograms, and this is like a summarization or a dendrograms of dendrograms, something like that, or a consensus tree, as it is referred to as. So this consensus tree summarizes the information from many different particular dendrograms. And as you can see, we've got a very nice branch for Sophocles. We've got a very nice branch for Aeschylus, with some work by Euripides written by Aeschylus. Ooh, that's interesting. Very non-likely, but it's what it is. We've got Aeschylus, and we've got someone who is from a different world, so comedy, but still from the same period, roughly the same period, Aristophanes with his comedy. So as we can see, those works that we expect to be guessed are guessed correctly, and this is Prometheus Bound, which sticks out, which
Yep.
is some
It's on its
elsewhere.
own.
Yeah, and that's an argument. That's not a smoking gun is again. But now, what if I follow this procedure of introducing some more noise here? By more noise, I suggest introducing some other works that have nothing in common. I mean, some
Cool.
crows.
Wow.
All right,
Nothing
so for those who are not watching, who are just listening, it's basically, I love the color coding. So the different works who we think are the different authors have been color coded with Aristophanes, Euripides, and they're all basically all clustering together. All the different colors are clustering together to show like these authorships look real. But the one Aeschylus Prometheus Bound has its own branch with nothing attached to it, and it sort of sticks out like a sore thumb a little bit when you do this.
That's it. Yeah. So
And
to
you-
me,
and-
that's
yeah.
a strong evidence. But as said, it's not a smoking gun situation.
But so we knew qualitative data, qualitative points that you made before was that, it takes 3 actors instead of 2, and usually he does it this way. So we can actually look at it qualitatively, which has been done, that was already done for thousands of years. So we have like a suspicion that Prometheus Bound is not written by him. But now that we throw math on top of it, it's just one more data point to go, well, we keep comparing it to everywhere else, and Prometheus Bound is just sticking out on its own branch. It seems pretty strong. Seems like a strong argument gets made.
To me, that's a strong argument, and to me, that's how this inference should look like, because we will never have the smoking gun show.
Yeah, because we don't have a time machine. I just want to go back to the first Dendrogram, like the narrative there. So you had Gallus Anonymous, who are you saying that was like the first Polish author to write in Latin? Did I understand that right? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. The Polish literature starts somewhere around for 13th, 14th century with very, very short Polish texts, but earlier the country was, of course, around for hundreds of years, but the state was established at the end of the 10th century with some documents sent from the papacy, from Vatican from Rome, to be correct, to the Polish king. So there are some very scarce documents, but the first solid narrative text is this chronicle from the beginning of the 12th century. So that's how we treat it as a holy grail or whatever. That's the text.
It's written in Latin because that was the trade language of the time, that they would communicate back to
that was the well, not official, because there was no official language, but there was communication language of the elites, as it was across the whole Europe.
Right. But you have this one document that you think it's about the Polish, it's like about the Polish history or something. How does it?
It's about the Polish the dynasty of the Polish kings.
Okay, and so I would guess maybe kids that grew up in Poland would maybe learn about Gallus Anonymous, at least cursorily, to say like, okay, there was this person that gave us the first description of the Polish kings.
Yeah, that's fair.
And now you're trying to figure out who the author was, and so you are able to take old Latin texts written by people that we know lived in Rome, or maybe they were priests or archbishops or whatever, and you can compare them, and you found that there's a monk in Italy who it looks like maybe is actually the author.
Yeah. That's a fair description. Except that I was not the first to suggest that very, very text to compare Gallus Anonymous against, because this hypothesis was around for like a few decades now.
Well, I think that's also worth noting is a lot of this, at least all the stuff that I've come across, these are ongoing arguments. I mean, these ideas of authorship have, it's not, there's not a lot of gotchas. But these has just been argued for so long, and so everybody's been looking for extra points to weigh in on one side versus the other. And so a lot of this is kind of, let's go back to the arguments and see if the math can help solve them, rather than creating our own new arguments, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a very, very fair description. But as said at the beginning, the notion of the authorship itself is kind of a wobbly concept, right? After Romanticism, when the idea of authorship was indeed romanticized, right? The single author that has a vision and they write down whatever they think. It didn't really work that well in the Middle Ages, when mixed authorship and incorporating someone else's stuff into your stuff was a norm rather than an exception. So we have to be careful here, right? Whenever we speak about single authorship of those things.
Can we, that might bring into a good, a little more controversial topic, but if we go into the New Testament and we found these guys, they wrote a book called Christ Before Jesus, and they essentially have tried to use stylometry and your algorithm to look at the authorship of the New Testament, and their findings are pretty controversial, to say the least. And are you aware? I think I brought it up to you when we met a couple weeks ago, but have you looked into that at all? Or I don't know if you have any ideas before we dive a little bit more into that around sort of what you would expect out of comparing these. Because I know that the general mainstream idea is, Paul wrote at least certainly these 4 specific epistles, but there's 13 that are being argued about. And then Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And, yeah. What do you think about the idea that this is proving these dendrograms are looking controversial coming out on the other side?
Yeah, that's a big topic. I haven't read the book, but I kind of know the argument. Well, good for them that they were exploring the things, of course, and I hope they took into consideration those assumptions that we covered here today. We have to remember all the time that New Testament, this is a composite thing. This is a mixture of everything. It is primarily oral literature that has been written down maybe years, maybe decades rather than centuries later. I would say decades. It's a fair estimate.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
It's written in ancient Greek. I hesitated for a sec because that's a special version of the ancient Greek, like a simpler, like a pidgin ancient Greek, which is referred to as Koine, which is a common language for the entire Commonwealth. So a simpler version of Greek, but the philologists can see. I cannot. I don't speak Hebrew or Aramaic, but the biblical scholars can see through this style the actual sayings of Christ, of Jesus Christ, being originally in Aramaic and Hebrew, and they can see, the syntax, the Aramaic syntax and Hebrew syntax shining through the New Testament in the text, right? So that's one of the things. The other thing is that those sayings and the whole story were around in oral tradition for maybe decades, but maybe longer. We don't know, right? Depending on what we think was the moment when it was written down. If the gap was like 12 months or 12 years or more,
Well,
we don't know that.
Can I stop you right there? So you're saying that the linguists know that Jesus' words were actually spoken in Aramaic, even though the original copy we have is in Koine Greek. So so then we don't know how long it was written and then copied in Aramaic before it was originally translated to Greek.
It probably was not written in Aramaic at all, but it was like preserved in oral tradition until it was written down in a different language, so meaning Greek, right? I mean, the apostles were using Aramaic as their day-to-day language or communication language, and Jesus was also using that language, except that when he was prosecuted and questioned by Pilatus or Pilate, or not sure how you pronounce it in English. Okay. It was probably in Hebrew, but we don't know. It might have been in Aramaic, but the Biblists know better. It was alive in the oral tradition until it was written in Greek. So there was a translation involved at the very beginning. The first written version was already in Greek, but the original was, like, the oral tradition was in Aramaic. Right? So that was the first element of this composite situation.
Yeah, their conclusion is quite controversial. They seem to indicate that the New Testament was was pretty much written in the 2nd century, so around like after the year 144, and they have both the stylometry and like qualitative and quantitative data to go over it. And it's not a new argument, to your point. Kind of, this has been argued about for thousands of years. They're just kind of picking up the ball. But yeah, that's kind of their conclusion, is that all of this stuff was written after 144 AD, which is, if true, is quite a long time after the events, and maybe just makes you think about taking them super literally or kind of getting the vibe of them, and which one's kind of maybe the wiser choice of the two.
Yeah, but
I don't know.
honestly, I can live with 144 and the oral tradition in between.
You can. That sounds fine.
Do you think that's because people were maybe more accustomed to oral traditions, so it would have been like okay,
definitely, yes.
So there is some validity to that argument, you think?
It was even, this kind of thinking that what is oral is more like important than what is in script, unlike today. Because today, when we do a deal, we say about the deal, it's not really in executable until we sign it. It was reversed in back in time, and that was one of the the meetings of the church in Nice, or somewhere, one of those first the gatherings, when they had to stand up one after another and say the oath or whatever they agreed on orally, and only then it became the thing, right?
Sure.
So that's a different thing in that's a different thinking in the oral tradition world. So I wouldn't be disappointed if it's
It's reasonable. That's okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's fair. I mean, if they were written, yeah, okay, I'll roger that.
Yeah, the counter argument, however, being that the so-called synoptic gospels, this is Matthew, everything except John, Matthew,
Matthew,
Luke,
Mark, Luke.
Yeah, Mark, Luke, they share like 50% of the material.
Yeah,
It's
right.
difficult to share that big portion of a material just orally for 144 years. So that would be a counter argument. But let's say,
Yeah, that's true. Well, and like one of the things, I think we ran one, and I was looking for it, and didn't find it. We got to run it again. But when we ran a dendrogram on the New Testament, what I saw was one of the things I remember was what Acts 1 and Acts 28 cluster together outside of the rest of Acts. And so the argument would be, if that's, what this is telling us is that someone had a different text, and then they wrote the intro and the outro, the first part and the last part on their own, and added it to this letter they had already.
that's
some
what
of that's
one does, yeah.
Yeah, and if I was gonna do that, right? I mean, if you got a letter and you want to add on to it, I mean, and paper, parchment paper. This is not. You don't go to Walmart and buy 500 of them for $5. I mean, paper is pretty rare, and it's expensive, and it's the iPhone. It is the thing of the day, and so it makes sense that you would try and be very careful with it. But why not just take the same text you have and add on the front the introduction and the exit, just to kind of put your framing on the topic to make sure your audience knows what you want them to see. So I just, even seeing some of that stuff seems okay to me, but I think a lot of people might get upset about that.
You've got a homework assignment, and you look at your empty sheet of paper for hours and hours, and you don't know where to start. Why don't you translate, the first paragraph from elsewhere?
Totally.
Probably normal to me.
It would have been the smart thing to do, rather than start from zero. It would have been the smarter thing to do.
Surely so. You've got a church to run, and you have to write a letter to your worshippers of your church. Then you have no time to waste.
Part of me thinks that's just really beautiful, actually, if that's happened, because it's everybody trying to say what they think is helpful and trying to lead everybody. But I don't know when it got switched over to this is a work of strict nonfiction, and whether that was the way to take it when it was being written. I don't know. It just brings up questions,
Well, it does. Some years, we don't know how many years, but years after that happened and was written down, it became the thing, right? Plus the assumption that God themselves kind of that's his or her hand, it makes a difference, right? If you think of
Yeah.
this Holy Scripture as something at least inspired by the Holy Spirit, if not more, then every single word taken out or written down extra does make a difference. So I understand those heated debates.
Well,
I really do.
and one of the questions that I have is like, the authors of these different books, like, did they know when they were writing it that in 1,000 years we were all going to have it bound on our bookshelves and it was going to be like holy scripture? Like when they're writing a letter, I mean, and if you didn't know that, like if you don't know I'm writing holy scripture, like when maybe they wrote it to help everybody out, and then like 100 years later or whatever, everyone goes, yeah, let's canonize that, and now it brings on a new meaning that even the author hadn't necessarily even meant when he wrote it. It was just a letter. And now it's like, no, this is doctrine. And I don't know if that's what he was doing when he was writing that letter. Maybe,
I'm
but
totally with you on that. Yeah, totally with
yeah,
you.
it gets
Let's don't let's not
anachronistically.
remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's not forget that most of those epistles, but also the Gospels themselves, were probably written kind of collaboratively. I mean, you can have one Luke or
Totally.
one Mark uh, holding the pen, but they would ask their colleagues, "But what did Jesus say on that day when we met him?"
Yeah.
Right? This kind
Well,
of
because
collaborative effort, right?
paper's expensive. You don't want to do one
It really
draft and then,
is.
hey, everybody read this. We're going to write another one, and then we're going to write another one. Like you would do that. You would think. It's like, it reminds me of painters when they're going to paint something. They kind of sketch it out in pencil first, and then they change it. And they do so much pre-work before they just put paint to canvas, because it's a huge canvas and they want to get it right. And you would think about these documents and these letters exactly the same. Like, hey, should I say it this way or this way? And maybe you have scrap stuff over here, so the one you write on is the final one. It seems like that's just a reasonable way to put these letters together.
That's exactly the case. Plus, let's not forget about the idea of sketching out the letter and then giving it to your secretary to just
Oh.
elaborate on that.
Or copy
Which
the middle, right? If I write the first paragraph and the last paragraph, let's get a scribe to just get that middle part in, and I got other things to do. Just, hey, copy that in, throw my thing on the front and back, and that's the letter going out. It's an email. It's our Friday, update on things. I don't know. I could see that, but it is interesting.
Do you have any intuition for when cultures became less oral tradition focused and started writing things down, or like when it changed in importance, when the writings became more important than the oral
Yeah.
tradition,
When
or
did
was
the
that
word
different across all
Yeah,
cultures? Maybe.
it depends on the culture, on the particular culture. But in Europe, or I take America as being part of Europe. I mean, culturally.
Yeah, for sure.
So in Europe, it must have been Middle Ages ish, kind of. But for elsewhere, I cannot say for sure. But in Eastern Europe, in maybe not even Poland, but Lithuania, those areas, it came later, like a century later or 2 centuries later. You can still see, for example, in the Polish literature of the 16th century, there are some guys that are definitely written down, but you can see in the way they write, they kind of think of this being read out or something like that, because they are very obsessed about saying what the next paragraph is going to be about. So they kind of provide you some guidance all the time, so that you don't lose the track, as if it was meant to be read out aloud, rather than just read silently by particular readers. So you can see those traces of the oral cultures to like 16th, 17th centuries in some countries in Europe. So that, yeah, it depends. It really does.
Oh, that's interesting.
You said something earlier that was really interesting. Did you say that it was a very romantic idea, and attached to the romantic part in history that one person would write an entire text? Even just the idea that I have some brilliant breakthrough and that I got to get it on paper and I solo do that. That concept to humanity actually really wasn't even considered until the romantic movements, basically.
Even worse, in the 16th, 17th centuries, in the early modern period, in the Renaissance, for example, or in the Baroque, there was this idea of imitation. and you're expected to show how good you are in reading the ancient authors by imitating them in the right way. So it was
No way.
even a welcome to have some pieces from the auctores, as it is referred in Latin, so the authors, capitalized, of course. Right?
It
The
gives
more
such
you show the knowledge about the authors, capitalized, the better for
it
your
it
own.
it shows you just have to be really careful to read any text that is more than 100 years old. We're reading it anachronistically if we don't take into account all of these things. Like, just to read any article from 1,000 years ago and think, oh, this is like a university textbook, just, or whatever you want to think it's like, without the proper context, you're going to read it with it's framed completely wrong. That's
That's a
crazy.
very fair assessment.
Yeah, you just think they're writing it. They might be writing in a culture where it's actually better to copy people, because you're showing that you know all these different people and I can incorporate all their ideas. That might be the thing that makes great writing at the time, not some romantic ideal of this beautiful vision that I've had that I have to get out on paper. That is so fascinating. That
Yeah, there
this
are
whole
even
ancient text.
theoretical takes on that. There are some authors, for example, this Isidore of Seville. You'll have to check out which century it is. It's
Okay.
early Middle Ages. The author of the first encyclopedia, because he was just gathering every single knowledge he could gather and put into one very very long work. And one of his thoughts was the ideas of authorship, and he said, like, there are four ways of being an author. One is that you just write someone else's, that you just a scribe. So you write down someone else's words word by word. The other is you're like elaborating on someone's notes, or translator. You're a translator. So you're an author by being a translator for language, one language to another. The third way was you're a commentator. So we've got say Holy Scripture, and then you on the margins you add in, commentaries. And only the fourth time was you write something taking the material from your predecessors. So there was no at all the idea that you create something from nowhere or nothing.
That
Not at
is
all.
amazing.
Why would you?
I wonder if some of these scribes sat down and, knowing that they were one of the only people thinking about how their time period was going to be recorded and how it interacted with older documents, I wonder if some of them felt like they held like the reins of history in their hands. They're like, man, I'm going to
Yeah, that
dictate
would be cool.
what history was to the rest of humanity. So I get to choose how this goes down. That's so
Did they know
crazy.
they were writing the history book?
Yeah.
Right. And what
Are
they
the,
did. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, Dr. Eder, like just out of your own personal curiosities, what are you, if you could crack one mystery in all of history, what would it be, given all the things you've looked at? You just have
Good
one
question.
pass to actually see the truth. Which one is it going to be?
Yeah, I would love to go to this concept of authorship as something, linguistic uniqueness. Can it be boiled down to some general laws of nature? Can we anyhow link the way in which we think? I mean, this frequencies of the words, this kind of things that we covered already. Is it a derivative of any of the bigger laws of nature? Right, that would be a
What do you mean by
mystery.
loss of nature? Like, kind of just living in cities and kind of getting out of nature, or what do you mean?
No, what I mean by that is that if you, for example, look at the sizes of the cities, you mentioned the cities,
Yeah.
then they also follow some mathematical distribution. Somehow we, the humans, know how to build the cities of a certain size. I mean, naturally, if we look at in the nest of ants, they also follow some distribution. Somehow the nature knows how to self-organize itself.
Yeah.
And my question would be whether or not this, uniqueness of language and the language itself is also, part of this bigger law of nature of self-organization, right? So that would be one of the
Like,
mysteries
are
I
there
wouldn't mind.
emergent properties as humanity scales up? Are there emergent properties of language that come out? Whoa, that's a good idea.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And does it apply across all languages? Like have you ever gotten a chance to look at any Chinese texts or any?
That's too. Yeah, Chinese is difficult because here not only we have the language barrier, but also a script is different. I mean, not only a different grammar, but also the script is different, and then it's difficult to define the word. So here, what I do, because I was asked this question, so with some students, we did some experiments with Chinese. We just switch from words to characters, to like pairs of characters, character bigrams or trigrams, something like that, to work around the problem of the word delimitation. But yeah, there are some languages in the case of which the question of the word itself is not trivial at all. But it seems that some of those laws and the authorial signal works across all the languages with some tweaks, with some for some languages you have to do some additional effort.
Yeah.
That's true, but it more or less works universally. That's also cool.
What do you think's left in stylometry? What other juice can we squeeze out of this thing, right? Like now that computers are coming up, and is it better algorithms? Is it obviously more data is always helpful, but how do you see stylometry continuing to kind of get better from here?
Yeah, mathematically, we are quite far already, but
Okay.
I think that those better models will be able to see more for sure. I mean, the statistical separation starts being visible when you use very, very primitive methods. But the more nuanced method, nonlinear methods, or probabilistic methods you use, the better the separation. So I think we have not said the last word here.
Yeah.
That's my intuition. I cannot prove it. So that would be one of the directions. But my big hopes is the using technology to enhance the text themselves. I mean, because now we can what we can do, we can just take the text as a string of characters. We can divide it into words by using space or something similar as delimiters, right? And then we can analyze this very, very shallow representation of language.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that there's going to happen quite a lot on enhancing this shallow representation of guessing, also the division into words, but also the division into morphemes or phonemes or something like that, that
Yeah.
will
Oh,
enhance what we are seeing right now. Quite right.
breaking up the words even. Yeah, and going even further into detail could yield
Absolutely.
more
Mhm.
insight.
And I love the idea you had of using LLMs to sort of tag different texts with whatever you can ask an LLM about that it could answer correctly, and then throw that into the data set to get more angles on it.
I don't really hope that using LLMs directly to say, hey, tell me
Yeah.
who wrote this or that will solve our problems, but using it as as a as an intermediate step to enhance the data.
That's right.
That's the
It can analyze text. And the beauty is it never gets tired, and it can do 1,000,000
That's true.
pages in like an hour. And so it maybe even that it can just do all the hard work in that it doesn't get tired. It can go through all the tedium of tagging every bit of text that we want it to with whatever we want to tag it with. And that's really valuable because to your point, a lot of it's
Never
just
gets
work.
tired and never gets annoyed when you ask the same question
No.
100 times.
And to some degree, this is just work, right? Tag this, tag all the stuff, because we got to get the data to analyze it properly. If you don't have good data, clean data in, clean conclusions out, dirty data in, dirty conclusions. And so LLMs can be really helpful in cleaning up the data, but let's still run the machine learning after that.
Will we be able to detect plagiarism? Like, will we be able to detect an LLM wrote something using stylometry? Or will LLMs instantly know how to bypass that?
Listen, no, it gets better and better every single month.
The LLMs do.
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
With my colleagues, we did some preliminary text by translating by Google Translate some words, say from French to English, and then in English you could still see the original signal
The signal.
shining through, but you could also be able to see the Google Translate at a specific translator's signal. But
Oh, it's like the editor of the text. The editor is showing himself. The Google or whatever.
As the editor.
Oh my gosh.
but not it's with LLMs it's getting more and more difficult every single month. That's amazing. It gets really
They're getting better.
Yeah.
yeah, very better.
Way faster, yeah.
That is amazing. Holy cow. What are you working on now? What do your grad students work on? Does everybody kind of pick their texts that they kind of want to go after, or like how do people study in this field? What does that look like?
That's a good question indeed, because this field does not really exist as a specific subfield. It's just a bunch of people going from different directions. The linguists interested in how language works, literary guys that want to solve some particular problems, but also there's a new field that is emerging: computational literary studies, like
Yeah,
CLS.
math. There's got to be a
which is
math
new.
side coming up, right?
Yeah.
In academia for it.
hmm Not only solving the authorship questions, but also these other layers that can be traced in text, like gender. Does gender exist? Did it exist in the 19th century? Does it exist in the contemporary literature? This kind of questions, right? Or in the linguistic subfield of that stylometric, the question of the diseases: is Alzheimer leaving a trace in language we speak? Or the personality, can we do the, rather than authorship attribution, authorship profiling? Can we profile someone in terms of their extroverticism, this kind of psychological traits? Can we trace them out, or not that much? So these are the questions that are being addressed. So depending on where you're from, you might be interested in some questions of that not really well defined subfield of study.
Man, that's so interesting. Weren't you telling me about? You told me a different story. It was about a guy, and he, the person who was taking care of him was helping with his notes or something. Do you know that?
Okay, yeah. You're asking about
What was
mixed
that guy?
authorship and different approaches to mixed authorship. Yeah, absolutely. I was talking about Francis Bacon, the famous
Yes.
Francis Bacon, the philosopher of the 17th century, big English name, who wrote lots of things, except that he didn't himself. He kind of did.
Yeah. Okay.
Spoiler
Yeah.
alert, he kind of did.
Spoiler. Okay, what happened?
Yeah, it turns out that the older he was, the more he was dictating rather than writing himself, and he would just stroll along the river Thames with his secretary, and just sketch out the general ideas for the secretary to elaborate on, and write down on paper in the final form. And then, because he was involved in many different governmental roles, I don't remember exactly what, but he was a busy person.
He was a busy
So,
guy.
yeah,
He was a Sir Francis Bacon.
absolutely, yes.
He had a lot of knightly duties he had to do. That's right.
So he had less and less time for this kind of entertainment, um, what we all mean by writing interesting books. So his most famous book, New Atlantis, was not written by him at all. It turns out he was just dictating or sketching out the general ideas to his secretary. Same about actually another very famous person from the 13th century France, Hildegard of France, Belgium. Hildegard of Bingen, another big name and visionary, and
In
a
music as well.
theorist of
Yeah.
musicology, and
Yeah.
lots of roles. And she was also not very confident about her Latin. She was, of course, very fluent, but as I'm kind of fluent in English, and this is not my native language, so I would rather ask someone to cross check my writing if there's, if the articles are correct, and, the usual stuff.
Reasonable.
She also, we didn't invent it. She did. She actually hired a person to correct her Latin, a native speaker better than her, to correct her Latin. And the older she was, the more power she just transferred to her secretaries. And we know the last secretary by name, that was Guibert of Gomblot, to whom she gave all the power, all the responsibility to write, because she wrote explicitly, "You will know better what I think," and she would just sketch the general ideas, and he would take over. And we can trace that stylometrically as well, right? When she in her last works, it was like a mixture of the two.
I mean, that is fascinating that you could take Sir Francis Bacon's work, and the first one he does is all of his writing, and then over time you can actually put them next to each other, and you can see the two authors, one goes down and one goes up, to where his last book was actually not him at all, it was his secretary. And you hear that and you go, of course. He's getting old, he's famous, he's rich, he's done a bunch of things, and someone else is doing it for him. And it's okay. It's just, but and of course it was his ideas, and maybe he sketched it out, but how interesting that we finally have math that can show that. Like, we can have these ideas, but now we have concrete algorithms that can run that through and go, yeah, there's two authors here. And in fact, one's 100%, one's 0. And by the end, they flip-flopped. We can show that. That's incredible.
It is, except that you have to be quite, resistant to the bitter truth sometimes.
Oh, you got to hold. Yeah, fair. That you can't.
I'm not talking about Sir Francis Bacon, but the biblical stuff. That's,
Yeah.
might get tough at times.
Yeah, it was tough because I see this dendrogram and a lot of the books are all overlapping. They're all jumbled. And like that one dendrogram you just showed us with Aeschylus they all clustered perfectly. Like, all the greens were together, all the reds were together, except for Prometheus Bound, which was on its own. And when you see the dendrogram from the New Testament, it's sort of all over the place. And so it's sort of,
To me, that's a sign that the signal is not strong here, and the final result should be kind of mitigated at times.
what do you
But
mean
the
by that?
evidence might be there, but we cannot put too much attention on that.
Yeah, well, would you expect to see if if everything's written by Paul, wouldn't you expect to see everything sort of cluster in one branch if it's all a singular author?
Yes, slash. The genre is also a factor here. So
Okay.
the episodes should cluster by definition. By definition, all the Pauline's episode with Peter, John, whoever else wrote those epistles, as opposed to the Revelation and the Gospels. When the Gospels are concerned, we know that they should be clustered together. The Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Luke, and Matthew,
Yep.
and John being separate, and that's what you're likely to be seeing.
And we did
But
see that.
again,
Matthew, Mark, and Luke are kind of clustering more so, and then John is kind of off on its own.
not surprised. Yeah, not
Yeah.
surprised at all. The good question is if John author the author of the Revelation is the same John of the Gospel, and stylometrically not at all.
Not at all. Yeah.
Also, the biblicists kind of agree that no, this is a different
Right.
person. So here's
Yeah.
no
And so it just
control.
shows, yeah, whoever wrote John didn't write Revelation. They
Yeah,
just,
two different
boom, they
Johns.
split it, and it's different Johns, and that's okay. Like, but it's just, yeah, what I've said this a few times, but it feels like humans have been arguing over this, or, debating it for thousands of years, and then like a robot just came in and was like, boop, there's the answers. Like, here you go. And it's sort of, I don't know if everybody knows what to do with it. Like, I don't know what someone who's studied this their whole lives, maybe it's cognitive dissonance. And I'm not saying it's all the way true on this side either, but I mean, it's new data that's much less opinionated than all the other data we've had before, because it's just a computer that's making correlations. And I don't know, it's interesting but it doesn't sound like that knocks you off your rocker. In fact, it feels like you've been swimming in this for decades.
Yeah, the only thing being that if the outcomes are a bit wobbly, you shouldn't put too much attention on what you're seeing, right? That's the single tiny side note that you should keep in mind.
Totally. That's fair.
Because it's a process of experimentation, so it takes a lot of tuning, and then you build your confidence as you tune and as you ask the different questions. I guess it's not just like a black and white yes or no.
Can be black and white at times, but think of actual fingerprints. Of course, in the police academy, you see a very, very clear cut fingerprints, but then, in fact, when you gather evidence, it's like a fragment, two fragments, out of which you have to extrapolate. Sometimes the evidence is strong, but usually it is not. same here, right? This idea of the fingerprint exists, and it's there. We can prove it. It is. But in fact, when you analyze, very short fragments that were probably written collaboratively or with the help of someone else, then don't expect the signal to be there.
Yep. Well, and that was interesting. One of the things that these guys had mentioned, and they showed in their data, is that there's a book, Philemon, and it's the shortest book. It's like, a couple paragraphs, and they basically were like, Philemon jumps around all over the place, depending on how we tune the algorithm, because it's a little amount of data. So we can't say anything about Philemon because there's not enough data to draw any serious conclusions. To your point, kind of as they keep tweaking it, if clusters stay similar, that's a stronger signal. And if you can keep tweaking it and things keep jumping around, then overall it's sort of a weaker signal in some ways.
Yeah. To me, that's a very good proxy to which extent the data is stable. Indeed. Yeah.
Yep. And they also slashed it into a different way. They said that they got a bunch of 1st century Greek, 2nd century Greek, 3rd century Greek, and 4th century Greek literature. And then they just clustered those, and they took the whole New Testament and said, what's the writing style like, right? So, because we write, if I was to write a paragraph in 1925, someone was to write a paragraph in English, they'll be very different. And they found that the whole New Testament clustered around the 2nd century. And that the writing style,
very fair assumption. To be honest, that's a very fair assumption because language is developing, and you do see, the temporal signal in the data very often.
Sure.
However, let's not forget that the New Testament was super influential, and the text from the 2nd, from the 3rd century might have been inspired this way or the other.
Yep.
By those very influential texts. So if we can rule out this factor, then I like this outcomes. Otherwise, I would ask this question to the authors.
And I think that's, it's a good summary. This is giving us hard quantitative data, but we also need to take into account qualitative data as well, of like, how is it being collected, and taking into these other, just using our brains actually to not just say, well, the math says this, so this is it, but interpreting it with everything else we already know, and that kind of provides the nuance. So that's why you really gotta get your brain around a specific topic. Even to your point, there, the idea that a single author would write something, it was a notion that didn't happen till the Enlightenment, basically. That's what makes good writing. And so why would anybody write that way 2,000 years ago? It wasn't even the way they wrote. So, I think even that sort of education is helpful for analyzing all these texts as well. There's tons around it that you have to know.
Yeah, and a friend of mine is using this analogy or a metaphor of taking blood samples. If you go to the doctor, you take blood sample, your urine sample, whatever, and then you take it to the lab. So the math does some things for you, and then it is being inspected manually by the doctor. The final word is, is someone who has a brain, right?
That's right. He's interpreting the data. Yeah, that's right. I like that. Man, this was great. Dr. Eder, thanks for spending some time with us. This was fantastic.
That was a big day for me as well.
Yeah. I mean, well, and it's interesting. I just learned, it seems to me a huge breakthrough in textual analysis that computers are now contributing. And I just think that more people should know about that, because it actually, to me, it solves more questions than it answers. And in this world of trying to figure things out, that's really helpful.
Well, but that's what the academic life is about. It's more questions than the answers, so that we have some jobs left. Yeah.
It's true. And there always are. I don't think we're ever going to run out of questions.
No.
But it is so interesting to learn about how computers now can help us analyze texts and contribute to authorship debates. And it's also pretty controversial. And so I really wanted, you're one of the experts in the field. You've defined one of the algorithms that's being used by other people. You've open sourced it, and you're very open to sharing that knowledge. So I really appreciate it. And we're just trying to, I wanted to understand it, and I want other people to understand it. I want other people to get it, but we can't all take the decades of our life like you and dive deep into it. So thank you for sharing with us, because, it's really helpful to understand how these, what's new in the world of textual analysis and debate. It's really helpful.
Thank you. You're totally welcome.
Yeah. On behalf of all the curious minded, we appreciate all the contributions you've made. because it
That's right.
stinks to just sit in questions all the time. It's really nice to hear that people are working on answers somewhere in the corners of the world. So thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Eder.
Oh, and if anybody wants to make a dendrogram, we actually made a little tiny software. It's at words.austinandmatt.com. If anybody wants to go, there's
Unreviewed.
Yes, I want to recommend that one. I've seen it work, and that was quite impressive.
you know,
cool.
we just thanks. Yeah, we threw it together. There's no login, no nothing, and I hope we'll keep it alive as long as we can. But it's interesting to just pick different things and create a dendrogram and kind of see what it looks like. So for those who haven't checked it out, that's one place you go, or just Google dendrogram and start looking at them to see what people have done. But yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, really appreciate your time.
All right, I think we're gonna call it a wrap. Dr. Eder, thanks so much. And
Fantastic.
and I guess you're in Poland, so anybody's out there in Poland, go visit Dr. Eder. He's the man. That's great. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, we appreciate it. We're gonna call it a wrap. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming,
Thank
Dr. Eder.
Thanks
Cool.
a lot.
See ya.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.